the merchant who secretly funded a daimyo. There is a truth that history rarely confesses. The most powerful hands are sometimes the quietest, calloused, not from sword or crown, but from counting, hiding, waiting. In the 16th century, as Kyoto's alleys overflowed with whispers and rice sacks, as shoguns drew new lines on blood-washed maps, one merchant shaped the fate of a warlord from the shadowy backrooms of his shop, proving that gold could move armies while the blade only threatened. His name is lost to the stones of Kyoto, written in merchant ledgers and erased from official scrolls. He had no samurai blood, no right to ride beside a daimyo, yet his decisions redrew destinies with every silent coin he slipped beneath the table. Imagine him, a trader in plain brown kimono, eyes lowered in the market, forever bowing, always agreeing, so ordinary he was invisible. But inside his warehouse, past stacked rice barrels and oiled paper screens, he hosted secret visitors cloaked in dusk. There, the fate of clans was traded like bolts of silk, because in Sengoku Japan, chaos was the only law, and everyone was someone else's pawn. At that time, Japan was fractured. Daimyo lords waged endless war for land, honor, and the right to speak their names above the city gates. The shogunate was weak, the emperor a ceremonial shadow, and Kyoto, a city meant for peace and poetry, was a chessboard flooded with spies. Merchants, by Confucian order, were the lowest class. They owned no swords, wore no family crests. Their only weapon was gold, and gold, as it turns out, was the one thing that could buy both victory and silence. This Kyoto merchant had watched the tides of war churn for years. He saw the daimyo rise and fall, armies march through rice fields, peasants pressed into forced labor as soon as their crops were harvested. To survive as a merchant was to understand risk. But he understood something deeper. Real power was not to be found in court or battlefield, but in the steady accumulation of trust, debt, and secrets. The daimyo he chose to support was neither the richest nor the strongest, but he was ambitious, with a hunger sharpened by past humiliations. Cut off from his clan's wealth, forced to operate on the fringes of politics, this warlord needed what the merchant had. Not just gold, but the kind of invisible logistics that could feed an army without drawing a rival's notice. The merchant became his silent sponsor. Under cover of night, ox carts rolled from Kyoto, laden with rice, steel, arrows, and salt, essentials for any campaign, but disguised as ordinary commerce. Couriers used false names and forged ledgers. If questioned, the merchant produced stacks of paperwork showing every grain accounted for in trade with distant provinces. But those buyers existed only on parchment. To the daimyo's enemies, the merchant's shop was nothing but a dull storefront, boring, unthreatening, a speck in the city's mercantile sprawl. But to the daimyo's closest men, it was the true heart of the campaign, a lifeline running beneath the notice of all. The merchant worked with ruthless precision. He bribed inspectors, staged accidents, even spread rumors about his own insolvency to avoid attention. No detail was too small. When bandits struck a convoy, he staged a public outcry, then quietly paid the survivors double to keep silent about the true nature of the cargo. When the daimyo's men needed a safe house, he lent them rooms in the city's inn, then burned the guest book. All the while, the merchant's fortune grew. Not only was he paid in future promises, land, protection, exemption from taxes, he was also accumulating information. Every samurai who came to him in need, every official who owed him a favor, became a thread in his private web. Even the city magistrate, tasked with rooting out corruption, came to him for discreet loans. His business became a mask, his daily life an act. At market, he haggled over rice prices with loud farmers, played the part of the penny pincher, argued over the thickness of silk bolts, all the while calculating how many barrels it would take to sustain a garrison through winter. He laughed at jokes he found tedious, tolerated insults from higher-born clients, and made sure no one remembered anything about him except that he was forgettable. Meanwhile, the daimyo's fortunes reversed. With steady supplies, he raised a loyal army, soldiers who ate well, wielded imported steel, marched under banners paid for by invisible gold. Victories followed. In time, rival lords sent envoys to the merchant, hoping to buy his neutrality or discover his secrets. He smiled and sold them tea. No hint of loyalty ever crossed his lips. There were close calls. One winter, a rival clan uncovered part of the supply chain and sent assassins to the merchant's shop. He survived by hiding in a barrel, breathing through a reed as the assassins ransacked his store, missing the trapdoor beneath a pile of moldy rice sacks that led to the city's ancient drainage tunnels. Afterward, the daimyo doubled his protection, posting hidden guards in the market. The merchant gained more than just safety. He gained a seat at the invisible table where decisions were made. When famine struck, it was his advice that diverted grain to villages loyal to the daimyo, starving the enemy out. When a corrupt tax collector tried to expose the merchant's double life, he vanished. Some say bought off, others say silenced by a random fire that swept the block. Through it all, the merchant never claimed power openly. He didn't dress above his station, didn't move into a grand house, didn't buy himself a title. He knew what happened to those who grew too visible. But those who understood, those who needed a favor or owed him their future, came to know that in Kyoto, armies and fortunes alike could be conjured not by the sword, but by the quiet, relentless ambition of a single trader. He played a game with no rules but his own, operating in negative space, trusted by no one and needed by all. The daimyo, secure in his new lands, honored the agreement. The merchant received fields outside the city, tax privileges unheard of for his class, and the kind of immunity that turned a lowly rice trader into a kingmaker. But he never left the marketplace. Every morning he returned to his stall, weighing grain, listening to gossip, smiling at the children who thought him a harmless old man. He watched as samurai passed by, oblivious to the truth, that their banners, their meals, their very armor were gifts from a man they'd never bow to, a ghost inside the city's living economy. The story ends as it began, in silence. The daimyo's victories were written in history, but the merchant's name dissolved like smoke, erased by his own careful hand. Some say his descendants still live in Kyoto, inheriting not lands or titles, but the secret that real power is silent, invisible, built from patience and risk, thriving where no one looks. The streets of Kyoto remember even if the records do not. Because in every era there are those who move the world, never with a sword, but with a single well-placed coin and the wisdom to let someone else take the glory. That is how a merchant at the bottom of Japan's rigid hierarchy reshaped a warlord's fate and changed the story of a nation, not by fighting, but by mastering the quiet art of staying unseen, holding the true reins from the shadows, proving that the future can be sold and bought and rebuilt, one secret at a time. The peasant who became a warlord, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Imagine the world into which Toyotomi Hideyoshi was born, a landscape ravaged by endless civil war, where social hierarchy was law and a peasant's fate was written in mud and sweat. Japan in the mid-16th century was a fractured nation, its people divided among warlords, each vying for power, and the lowest rung, peasants, expected to live and die unnoticed, bound to land they did not own. In this world, a boy named Hiyoshimaru was born to a humble foot soldier, destined for obscurity. But history is sometimes bent not by privilege, but by something far more dangerous: unrelenting will. Hideyoshi's early years are a fog of legend and hardship. Without family wealth or samurai status, he had nothing to offer but his own wits and a willingness to serve. At a young age, he left his village, reportedly carrying nothing but a staff and a stubborn heart. He began his life's gamble by entering the service of Oda Nobunaga, a ruthless warlord on a mission to unite Japan by any means necessary. Most samurai would have dismissed Hideyoshi as nothing, an errand boy at best, but Nobunaga was notorious for recognizing rare talent wherever it appeared. Hideyoshi seized every chance to make himself indispensable, fixing sandals for his master, cleaning armor, running messages through dangerous territory. He studied the world of the samurai, not just its weapons, but its games of honor, deceit, and pride. Hideyoshi's genius was not brute force. It was the ability to read men's hearts, to listen when others talked, and to see openings where others saw only walls. When others were rigid, he was fluid. When samurai scoffed at his lack of heritage, he made himself useful. When rivals insulted him, he bowed, and then found a way to gain their trust. The art of flattery, negotiation, and careful listening, these became his weapons. Nobunaga saw something most missed: Hideyoshi's gift for loyalty and problem-solving. When the Oda clan's fortifications were breached, Hideyoshi helped repair them. When food ran low during sieges, Hideyoshi managed supplies and kept morale high. Each victory earned him more trust. Each obstacle became a step up. In 1560, Oda Nobunaga's rise accelerated after the legendary Battle of Okehazama, but it was in the brutal wars of unification that Hideyoshi truly distinguished himself. Nobunaga entrusted him with missions no other would take: negotiating with stubborn allies, infiltrating enemy strongholds, building castles in record time. At Tsunemata, Hideyoshi built a fortress overnight, a feat that became the stuff of legend. The enemy awoke to find an imposing new threat, one that should have been impossible. The trick was boldness, deception, and ceaseless work. Hideyoshi used common laborers, promised reward, worked them through the night, and made what seemed like magic from sweat and hope. As Nobunaga's power grew, so did Hideyoshi's responsibilities. He became a general, then a senior advisor, but what set him apart was not just ambition, it was his uncanny sense for alliances and betrayal. Hideyoshi flattered the proud, soothed the resentful, and forged bonds across rival clans. When Nobunaga was betrayed and forced to commit suicide by Akechi Mitsuhide, chaos erupted. Hideyoshi, on campaign far away, acted with a speed that stunned everyone. He secured peace with enemies, rallied allies, and marched his army in a furious, almost impossible rush to avenge his lord. In a matter of days, he tracked down and defeated Akechi at the Battle of Yamazaki, ending the rebellion and seizing the mantle of leadership for himself. Suddenly, the lowly peasant stood at the top of a samurai army, but the path was not yet secure. Rival generals, Tokugawa Ieyasu among them, watched Hideyoshi, waiting for a mistake. Yet Hideyoshi wielded not just swords but strategy. He offered power sharing, negotiated marriages, rewarded loyalty, and punished betrayal with shocking swiftness. He consolidated the Oda territories, defeated the mighty Hojo clan, and, unlike most conquerors, often spared defeated enemies if it served future stability. His greatest weapon was adaptability. In a world of rigid honor codes, Hideyoshi shaped new rules. He began reshaping society. Peasants were forbidden to carry weapons, preventing future upstarts like himself, ensuring that samurai alone had the right to rule. He surveyed all land, instituted a rigid class structure, and started building Osaka Castle, a fortress so imposing it symbolized a new era. As Kampaku, or imperial regent, he now controlled the emperor's court, commanding respect across all Japan. Yet Hideyoshi's rise was more than personal ambition. It was the axis on which Japanese history turned. He unified the war-torn nation, brought an end to the Sengoku era's chaos, and set the stage for centuries of relative peace under the Tokugawa shogunate. Hideyoshi launched grand projects, attempted to invade Korea, and sought to leave a legacy that would outlive the memory of his humble origins. Even as he reached the height of power, Hideyoshi was haunted by the knowledge that status in Japan could be as brittle as a cherry blossom. He was both a symbol of hope for the downtrodden and a warning to those who would dare to rise. Hideyoshi's story asks a dangerous question. What happens when a man refuses to accept his station? He was both adored and feared, admired for his audacity, despised by samurai purists. His policies were sometimes harsh, even ruthless, designed to keep others from repeating his own meteoric ascent. But in the end, Hideyoshi's legacy was transformation. He proved that destiny was not fixed, that cunning, loyalty, and vision could bend the rules of birth. And in the quiet spaces between battles and betrayals, one can imagine the old peasants in the fields whispering his name, daring to believe that for a brief, blinding moment, the unthinkable had come true. One of their own had changed the fate of an entire nation. As the sun set on his life, Hideyoshi stood not as a footnote, but as the architect of a new Japan, a land forged from ambition, suffering, and the dangerous hope that even the lowest born could rewrite history. His story survives as proof that in the heart of the storm, the smallest seed can grow into a force that shapes empires. In every age, there are those who accept their fate and those who defy it. Hideyoshi was the latter, and Japan would never be the same. The woman who controlled a samurai clan from behind a curtain. In a world dominated by armored men, rigid codes, and sharp steel, power usually announced itself with a clang, through the sword, the march, the shouted command. But in the early Edo period, behind the walls of Japan's most secretive palaces, there was a power even sharper than a samurai's blade. It belonged not to a warlord, not to a general, but to a woman who spent her life behind silken curtains, orchestrating the fates of daimyo and emperors with nothing but her words, her silence, and her unbreakable mind. Her name was Kasuga no Tsubonin, Lady Kasuga. And this is the story of how a woman with no title, no lands, and no army quietly controlled one of the most powerful clans in history. Lady Kasuga was born Saido Fuku in 1579, the daughter of a minor samurai retainer. Her beginnings were modest. Nothing suggested she'd be more than a shadow in the margins of samurai society. But the Sengoku era was an age of chaos and opportunity, where the ambitious could sometimes rewrite their fates. Fuku's life changed forever when she entered the service of the Tokugawa family, soon becoming wet nurse to the future shogun, Tokugawa Iemitsu. In that role, she became more than a caretaker. In the eyes of the court, a wet nurse was almost a second mother. She gained access to the innermost chambers of power and, more importantly, formed a bond with the child who would one day rule Japan. The political world Lady Kasuga entered was as dangerous as any battlefield. The Tokugawa clan, under Ieyasu, had unified Japan, but peace was fragile and enemies lurked in every direction. To secure his lineage, Ieyasu needed absolute loyalty and a network of eyes and ears within his own court. Lady Kasuga became one of those trusted eyes. Through quiet observation, subtle influence, and constant loyalty, she rose from the margins to the heart of the Tokugawa inner circle. But Lady Kasuga's true rise began when Iemitsu became shogun as a teenager. Court politics in Edo Castle were a maze of alliances and betrayals. The real battles were fought in hushed voices, behind closed doors, with information as the most valuable weapon. Lady Kasuga's chambers became a hub for secret meetings. From behind a curtain, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, she advised, cautioned, and when needed, manipulated those around her. She knew how to wield silence as a threat and warmth as a lure. When Daimyo plotted against the Tokugawa, Lady Kasuga's informants caught the first whispers. She relayed secrets not as accusations, but as quiet warnings, steering Iemitsu's decisions. When rival clans tried to outmaneuver the Tokugawa, she anticipated their moves, playing one ambition against another until rivals neutralized each other without a single sword drawn. Her greatest diplomatic coup was in courtly etiquette and marriage politics. In a culture where marriage could seal alliances or spark war, Lady Kasuga arranged and sabotaged unions with surgical precision. She understood the ambitions of noble women, the fears of nervous lords, and the shifting tides of imperial favor. Her ability to read people was legendary. More than once, her interventions prevented rebellions before they started, all under the pretense of household management. Yet, she was always careful to remain invisible. Her power existed only as long as it was unofficial. In the eyes of outsiders, she was merely a caretaker, a matron, a trusted servant. But inside Edo Castle, everyone knew. Without Lady Kasuga's approval, nothing truly important happened. Her influence was institutionalized when Iemitsu, grateful for her lifelong loyalty, entrusted her with the Oku, the shogun's harem, and the most secretive, political, and dangerous place in Japan. The Oku wasn't just a residence. It was a shadow government, filled with noble women, concubines, and female spies. Lady Kasuga, as the first official overseer, transformed it into a fortress of information and loyalty. She set rules, managed intrigue, and ensured no woman entered the shogun's presence without her consent. The Oku became her fief, and its reach extended far beyond its walls. Behind the scenes, Lady Kasuga also orchestrated the careers of men. She recommended samurai for key posts, quietly removed those who threatened stability, and rewarded loyalty with opportunities. Even high-ranking daimyo were careful not to cross her, knowing that a word from her could mean sudden disgrace. Through it all, she played a longer game than any man in armor. She survived the shifting favor of shoguns, the jealousy of rivals, and even the threat of being exposed as too powerful. She was accused of witchcraft, of manipulation, of arrogance, but no evidence ever stuck. Her defense was always humility, an artful deference that hid the iron beneath her silks. What drove Lady Kasuga? At her core, she was loyal to the Tokugawa and to the boy she'd raised as a son. Her power wasn't about personal gain, but about protecting a fragile order. She believed the stability of the shogunate was the only thing that could save Japan from returning to chaos. Every whispered word, every calculated silence, every subtle nudge was designed to reinforce that stability. Lady Kasuga's legacy echoes through Japanese history not just as a woman of power, but as an architect of invisible control. When she died in 1643, the court mourned her not just as a caretaker, but as the woman who, for decades, had kept the wheels of the shogunate turning, sometimes from behind a curtain, sometimes from the shadows, but always at the center of events. Her story isn't just about the rare woman who rose above her status in a man's world. It's a lesson in the true nature of power, that sometimes the greatest influence is never seen, only felt in the outcomes that shape a nation's destiny. While men fought and plotted in the open, it was Lady Kasuga who often determined which way the wind would blow inside Edo Castle. Proof that in history's greatest dramas, the most important moves are sometimes made by those who remain unseen. So when you imagine the power struggles of samurai Japan, look past the armored figures and the clashing swords. In the hush of the palace, behind the silken curtain, there was a mind sharper than any katana, a woman who mastered not just survival but supremacy through the secret channels of the human heart. This is the legacy of Lady Kasuga, proof that history can be rewritten not with war, but with wisdom, patience, and the art of seeing what others miss. In the great ledger of Japan's shogunate era, her name is inscribed not in ink, but in the silent choices that shaped an empire, one whispered secret at a time. The Ronin who trained peasants in secret. In the remote folds of Japan's feudal countryside, there existed a silence enforced by centuries of law, an order so strict that even the right to carry a blade was reserved only for the warrior class. The peasants' hands were meant for rice and mud, not steel and blood. But in the shadowed years after Civil War, the lines between law and survival blurred, and a single disgraced samurai, a Ronin, masterless and shunned, saw the emptiness where justice should have been. His name, lost to time, echoes only in rumor and trembling folk tales. This is the story of the Ronin who dared to teach peasants the way of the sword, a secret rebellion wrapped in ritual and desperation, and of villagers who, for the first time, refused to bow to fate. Imagine the scene, a small thatched-roof village nestled between rice paddies and dense forests, its people haunted by more than just the hunger of famine. Bandits rode through these lands like storms, raiding, burning, taking what they pleased, knowing the law left the unarmed utterly helpless. Villagers would kneel and plead, but the swords of the samurai were reserved for lords, not for farmers begging for their lives. In this world, a Ronin was an outcast, cut off from his clan and his honor, living between the codes of Bushido and the ache of survival. No one trusted a masterless samurai. No one expected mercy from a system that prized obedience over justice. But the Ronin who came to this village was different. Worn by disgrace but not broken, he arrived in ragged armor, carrying scars from battles fought for masters who were now dust. His crime was one of conscience, a refusal to obey an unjust command, or perhaps a moment of mercy where cruelty was demanded. Exiled, he wandered until hunger and fatigue brought him to a village so poor even the bandits barely noticed it. The villagers fed him, not because they had much, but because suffering makes kin of strangers. In their faces he saw not weakness, but a stubborn, unbroken spark, the same spark that burned in his own chest. It began, as such things often do, with ritual. In feudal Japan, religious ceremonies were the only spaces where peasants could gather freely. They could chant, move, bow, and even mimic the forms of warriors in the name of appeasing the spirits. The Ronin saw an opening. He began to teach the villagers prayers that looked suspiciously like sword kata, the formal, ritualized movements of combat. In the flickering light of dusk, they moved together, bare sticks in their hands, reciting invocations that doubled as code words. The village priest, whether out of courage or silent conspiracy, blessed these ceremonies, giving the training a sacred veneer. The Ronin's methods were subtle. Each motion was a lesson hidden in devotion. The sweep of a broom became a defensive parry. The raising of hands to the heavens, a block against an overhead strike. The pounding of mochi rice, a drill for grip and stance. At first, the villagers laughed at their clumsiness, but laughter soon gave way to awe. Old men found hidden strength. Children who had never held more than a sickle learned the balance of a wooden staff. Even the women, even invisible in stories of war, learned to move with the patience and precision of seasoned warriors. But secrecy was everything. The Tokugawa shogunate's laws were merciless. Peasants found bearing arms faced death, and those who trained them risked even worse. The Ronin drilled his pupils in silence, always ready with a plausible excuse, always watching for the eyes of an informer. The punishment for discovery was annihilation, not just for the teacher, but for the entire village. This was not a story of open rebellion. This was the slow kindling of resistance in the darkness, hope fed by whispers and sweat, not banners and battle cries. Time passed, and the villagers changed. Their eyes sharpened, their backs straightened, and a quiet confidence threaded itself through daily life. Bandits began to notice the difference. Fields tended faster, villagers moving with uncanny coordination. Sensing something amiss, a gang of outlaws decided to strike, expecting only frightened farmers and easy loot. But the Ronin was ready. He'd scouted the land, drilled the villagers not just in swordplay, but in the art of anticipation, setting traps with farming tools, using the curves of the land, the choke points of narrow lanes, the timing of dusk and fog. This was not the art we saw of noble battle. It was survival honed into a silent weapon. The night the bandits struck, they found not sheep, but wolves in peasants' clothing. The first wave fell into hidden pits, their shouts muffled by mud. Others rushed forward, only to be met by a coordinated line of villagers wielding sharpened staves and sickles, moving in the patterns the Ronin had drilled into their bones. The Ronin himself led from the shadows, striking where the attackers were weakest, turning chaos into choreography. The villagers fought with desperation, but not recklessness. They protected each other, retreated in formation, feinted and countered, like a river bending around a stone. By dawn, the bandits were gone, some dead, some fleeing into the forests, their confidence shattered by peasants who had learned to fight as one. The village stood, battered but unbroken, staring in awe at what they had become. In the aftermath, there was fear. The law would demand answers for blood spilled by unworthy hands. But the Ronin counseled silence. The victory was spoken of only as a miracle, the result of divine protection and the ancestors' blessing. No swords were displayed, no training admitted. The priest gave thanks to the spirits, and life returned to its hard, quiet rhythm. Yet everything had changed. The village was no longer prey. The villagers, once bound by the roles assigned by birth, had crossed a forbidden line. They had tasted agency, learned that the right to defend oneself was not a privilege given, but a truth to be claimed in secret. The Ronin, his purpose fulfilled, prepared to leave. He knew that to stay would risk exposure. His teachings would live on, hidden in plain sight, in the way rice was planted in formation, the way children ran drills as play, the way a broom was gripped just so. This story is not one of revolution, but of evolution. It is the story of how a single person, broken but principled, gave a village the tools to reclaim their dignity. It is about the risk of teaching forbidden knowledge and the courage required to learn it. In the annals of Japan, the tale of the Ronin who trained peasants might only survive in whispers and family legend, but its lesson echoes through every age. That sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen not on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when fear is overcome by solidarity, and the powerless learn they need not be powerless forever. For centuries, those in power have tried to keep the blade and the book in separate hands, insisting that peasants must remain peasants and warriors must remain warriors. But human history is full of moments when those boundaries dissolve, when suffering forces the meek to become strong, and when the cast-off become the teachers of the forgotten. The Ronin who trained villagers under the cover of religion left behind more than secret techniques. He left a blueprint for resistance, a memory that would ripple through generations whenever injustice threatened the innocent. In the years that followed, the village never forgot its lesson. Children's games took on the rhythm of kata. Rituals masked secret rehearsals for survival. Stories of the Ronin faded into myth, but every villager carried a fragment of his legacy. And in times of danger, the people remembered that they were not merely subjects to be ruled, but a community that could defend itself, together in silence, with the resolve that comes only from shared struggle. This is how a disgraced warrior, cast out by society, became the guardian of those who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. This is how forbidden knowledge became the seed of resilience, and how, in one hidden village, the powerless quietly rewrote their fate. The courtesan who blackmailed the elite, under the haze of oil lamps and drifting incense, the Yoshiwara district of Edo pulsed with secrets far more potent than any sword. Here, behind closed lattice doors and heavy curtains, the pleasure quarters played host to some of the most powerful men in Japan and some of the most cunning women. This is the true story of one Oiran, a courtesan whose beauty was only the beginning of her power. She became the architect of her own destiny, not through seduction alone, but through intelligence, memory, and a careful kind of vengeance that turned the entire social order on its head, without ever drawing a blade. In the rigid feudal hierarchy of Tokugawa Japan, a courtesan might seem like a pawn, adorned in silks, trained in poetry, song, and the gentle arts, but ultimately disposable. The Oiran were the highest class of courtesans, celebrities in their own right, dazzling the wealthy and the noble with elaborate hairstyles and kimonos worth a year's wages. Yet beneath the lacquered surface, these women survived by navigating a minefield of politics, envy, and desperation. What set one particular Oiran apart was not her looks, but her ability to see the unseen currents of power, to turn her vulnerability into her greatest weapon. From a young age, she observed everything. Which samurai boasted loudly and which ones listened, which merchants brought gifts and which tried to haggle, who paid in gold and who in promises. She remembered names, family crests, odd habits, whispered regrets uttered after too much sake, and the peculiar codes that bound her clients to their secret lives. She kept mental ledgers of every visit, dates, moods, the gifts exchanged, even the rumors they shared after letting their guard down. Some say she scribbled coded notes on slips of rice paper hidden inside hair ornaments, or stitched messages into the lining of her kimono. The truth is less theatrical, but more dangerous. She simply remembered everything, turning her mind into a vault no one could crack. In the floating world of Yoshiwara, information was currency. A careless word could destroy a reputation or secure a favor. Samurai and daimyo came to the district seeking escape, but in their comfort they forgot the danger of talking too much. For years she listened, smiled, and said little. The samurai who frequented her room believed she was loyal, perhaps even naive. In truth, she was waiting. One client, a high-ranking retainer, arrogant and careless, sought to take advantage of her. When she resisted, he threatened her with violence and disgrace. In the world outside Yoshiwara, a courtesan's reputation was always at risk. One rumor could ruin her, and there were always others waiting to take her place. But unlike most, she was not defenseless. Instead of fleeing or submitting, she sent a quiet message to one of his rivals, using a trusted intermediary. Just a taste of the secret she held, times, names, and a subtle hint about a hidden transaction. Nothing explicit, just enough to confirm her credibility. In a matter of days, rumors spread through Edo's elite like wildfire. The samurai's enemies moved swiftly, undermining his position at court, twisting every hint of scandal to their own advantage. He was left isolated, shamed, and most importantly, afraid. The Oiran did not need to blackmail outright. She never threatened, never wrote a note demanding money or silence. She simply let it be known through the most delicate channels that she was a woman who remembered everything and who could be very loyal to those who treated her well. The same samurai who once saw her as a plaything now offered gifts for her discretion, eager to avoid the same fate as their fallen peer. Yoshiwara's corridors were soon filled with whispers. Some men claimed she was a witch, others a demon in human form. But most understood, the Oiran was now untouchable. Her enemies melted away while allies came forward, offering protection. Even the district's officials, who usually turned a blind eye to the suffering of courtesans, began to show her respect. They knew she held the reputations of half the city's elite in her hands. She did not use her knowledge recklessly. She protected clients who showed her kindness, even steering them away from dangerous political traps or personal mistakes. To those who sought to harm her, she offered only warning glances and subtle hints of what she knew. More than once, an enemy who planned to ruin her reputation or discard her was quietly removed from power, brought down not by the blade, but by the weight of their own secrets. Other Oiran in the district began to follow her lead, taking care to remember more, to listen more deeply, to protect themselves not just with beauty or charm, but with knowledge. In time, the balance of power in Yoshiwara shifted. The most celebrated courtesans were not those with the prettiest faces, but those whose company was safest for the powerful men who sought their comfort. A single misstep could mean ruin, but a trusted confidant was worth her weight in gold. Her story spread quietly through Edo, repeated by merchants and minor samurai who hoped to learn her secrets. Some said she had a hidden room filled with scrolls and blackmail letters. Others believed she could recite the names of every official in the city from memory. The truth was simpler and more frightening. She understood the power of reputation in a world built on appearances. In a society where women were rarely granted agency, where a courtesan's future could be shattered by a single rumor, she created a new kind of power. Her position was always precarious. Every day was a dance on a blade's edge. But by refusing to be a victim, by turning her vulnerability into a shield, she forced the men who sought to control her to play by her rules. Some hated her for it, some admired her, but all respected her. Long after her death, her legend endured, not as a tale of seduction or tragedy, but as a quiet revolution in the heart of the floating world. She did not bring down governments or lead armies, but she showed that even in the most restrictive corners of society, there were ways to resist, to protect oneself, and to turn the tables on those who believed themselves untouchable. She became a silent mentor to generations of courtesans who followed, teaching them to value their minds as much as their beauty. And for the elite of Edo, she was a reminder. Every secret whispered in the darkness might one day see the light. In the world of power and pleasure, it was never the loudest or the strongest who held sway. It was the one who listened, who remembered, and who knew exactly when to speak. Such was the legacy of the Oiran who blackmailed the elite, a woman who transformed the delicate art of memory into a weapon sharper than any sword, and whose story, even centuries later, haunts the silent corridors of Yoshiwara. The farmer who masqueraded as a monk. Imagine a world where every harvest feels like a wager. One season of poor rains, one unexpected levy, and your family's future hangs by a thread. Medieval Japan was a landscape stitched with risk and watchfulness, where the cycle of rice and tax pressed down on the common farmer like the unyielding weight of the sun at noon. It was a world where cleverness sometimes mattered more than courage, and where those at the bottom of the hierarchy learned that survival itself could become a form of artistry. It is from this landscape that the tale of the farmer who masqueraded as a monk emerges, half rumor, half lesson, wholly real in the silent desperation that fueled it. He was an ordinary man, anonymous like most peasants, living in the shadow of lords-in-law. He tilled the same fields as his father and his grandfather before him, his days ruled by weather, insects, and the unblinking gaze of the taxman. In that age, the state's appetite was insatiable. The daimyo demanded rice for his armies. The village head demanded tribute. The temple demanded offerings. If there was a poor harvest, it was never the collectors who went hungry. Our farmer saw the logic of the system. He also saw its loopholes. In medieval Japan, the Buddhist temple was not just a place of prayer, but a realm outside ordinary law, a sanctuary of spiritual and legal immunity. Priests and monks lived free of tax, protected by imperial decree. Temples owned land, received donations, and operated almost as sovereign worlds within the larger chaos. For the desperate or the clever, the saffron robe could be a shield stronger than armor. One evening, as cicadas buzzed above the rice paddies, the farmer made his decision. He shaved his head by candlelight, using a dull blade. The mirror he used was a bowl of water, his own face warping in the ripples, half familiar and half ghost. He wrapped his body in rough-dyed cloth, imitating the humble robes he'd seen in passing monks. There was no ceremony, no vow, only a silent pact, to outwit the system that had wrung every drop of sweat from him. He left his village at dawn, walking barefoot along the road to the next province. No one looked twice at a wandering monk. The roads of Japan teemed with holy men, some genuine, some not, moving from temple to temple, from city to town, collecting alms and blessings in equal measure. When he entered his first village, he bowed deeply, recited half-remembered sutras, and blessed the sick with careful solemnity. The people offered him coins, rice, dried fish, small gifts in return for prayers they hoped might buy protection or luck. To those who saw him, he was no different from the thousands of mendicants who wandered the country. He slept in borrowed sheds, beneath temple eaves or under the open sky. He traveled light, carrying little but a begging bowl, a bamboo staff, and a memory of the life he had left behind. Each time he approached a new town, he would repeat the ritual, bowing at the temple gate, asking for sanctuary, performing chants at dawn and dusk. He learned quickly to mimic the rhythm of the monks, the cadence of their words, the tilt of their heads, the manner in which they thanked the villagers for alms. For a time, the ruse worked better than he could have dreamed. In some villages, he found shelter and respect he'd never known as a farmer. He ate better than he had in years. No official dared challenge his status. After all, to accuse a monk of fraud was to risk offending the gods. And worse, the real monks whose alliances reached deep into the feudal courts. But beneath the surface of his new life, the farmer lived with a quiet tension. Every coin he collected was a gamble, every chant a bluff. He feared the keen eyes of temple elders, the sharp suspicion of seasoned priests who could smell imposture in the way a man knelt or prayed. Yet the hunger to survive was stronger than fear. His performance deepened. He memorized longer sutras, copied the subtle gestures monks used during blessings, learned the basics of incense and bell, and even practiced the intricate calligraphy expected of a temple scribe. The line between act and reality blurred. In some towns, he became a fixture, offering counsel to grieving families, reciting prayers at funerals, even leading small rituals for the protection of crops. He collected more donations, enough to send small gifts to his real family, hidden in baskets of grain with cryptic notes. His old identity shrank, replaced by the certainty that he had beaten the system, at least for now. But the system had its own guardians. Local monks, attuned to the ebb and flow of travelers, began to hear rumors. A new holy man, young and unconnected, moving quickly from place to place, collecting unusually large donations. Monasteries in neighboring provinces compared notes. One night, as our farmer monk prepared for sleep in the back of a small shrine, a group of real monks approached him. They questioned him gently at first, about doctrine, lineage, temple history. The farmer tried to bluff, reciting what he'd memorized. But monks, like tax collectors, have their own rituals for exposing fraud. When he failed a simple test, misquoting a core tenet, one monk smiled, soft and dangerous. In that moment, the mask fell away. Yet just as swiftly as his secret was revealed, the farmer vanished. Some say he fled into the night, outpacing the monks along hidden trails known only to peasants. Others claim he melted back into the river of travelers, changing his name and appearance, resurfacing in another province under another guise. There are whispers that he returned to farming, poorer but wiser, never again daring to outwit the gods. There are even stories that he found sanctuary in a distant temple, where a kindly abbot recognized not just the fraud, but the desperate skill it took to survive, and offered him a real place among the order, transforming escape into redemption. The villagers remembered the farmer monk for years, telling tales of the clever peasant who nearly outplayed both man and heaven. His story became a caution and a legend, a parable of wit, desperation, and the blurry lines between sacred and profane. For in the end, his life was the story of every person pressed to the margins, forced to choose between obedience and survival, invention and erasure. He was a phantom who moved through the cracks in the system, exposing the fragility of every wall built to keep the powerless in their place. In a world obsessed with order, he showed that sometimes the greatest act of devotion is not to the gods or the lords, but to the simple, unyielding will to endure, to feed one's children, to bend without breaking. His legacy lingers in every story of the peasant who outwitted the lord, every tale of the outsider who donned a robe to become more than what birth allowed. Because history, at its core, is written not only by the victors or the pious, but by those who vanish, leaving behind only the faint, indelible echo of a life lived defiantly between the lines. The artisan who built a hidden empire. In the shadows of Japan's war-torn centuries, power was never just a matter of the sword. It was about who made the sword, who controlled the flow of steel, and who could place a weapon in the right hand at the right time. In an era where the strict samurai codes governed every rank and where the swordsmith's place was supposed to be small, nameless, faceless, and forgotten, a single artisan dared to upend that order. His name is lost to history, but his empire ran like veins beneath the surface of society. His legend remains whispered in the spaces between law and chaos, proof that true power often hides in plain sight. He began as all swordsmiths did, with his hands in fire and his back bent over the anvil, learning to shape folded steel into the legendary blades of Japan. In every stroke of his hammer, he absorbed the stories of his elders, how artisans, though respected for their craft, were forbidden by law from owning land, from amassing true wealth, from ever rising above their station. The ruling classes knew the danger of giving too much freedom to those who forged the nation's lifeblood. Its swords. A swordsmith might be essential, but he was never meant to lead. But where most artisans bent to this fate, this swordsmith's ambitions ran deeper. He saw opportunity in the cracks of the system. Wars were endless. Demand for blades was constant. Yet every new decree tried to limit the reach and autonomy of those who supplied the weapons. He realized early that what the powerful feared most was not the swords themselves, but the men who could put them in the wrong or the right hands. He began small. Under cover of night, he traded not just blades but secrets, learning which clan needed arms and who within each household hungered for power. He crafted swords with hidden marks, allowing those in the know to recognize his work without ever saying his name. He assembled a network, not of samurai or merchants, but of fellow artisans, apprentices, and couriers who moved unseen through the villages and mountain passes. A new order emerged, a guild of shadowy hands who supplied what the law forbade. Through whispers and coded messages, the network grew. His forgers operated in hidden workshops, sometimes deep in forests, sometimes beneath legitimate smithies, producing blades and tools not listed in any registry. Smugglers carried these goods in false-bottom carts, concealed within shipments of farm tools or ceramics. Each province believed it was policing its own borders, never realizing that a single artisan was orchestrating a secret empire that stretched across 5 domains. The risks were enormous. Discovery meant torture or execution, not just for him, but for everyone connected to his shadow guild. Rival swordsmiths would have betrayed him for a sliver of power, but he bought loyalty with a currency more valuable than gold: protection and opportunity. For young apprentices, the promise of steady work and a share of forbidden profits was enough to risk everything. For desperate villagers, his network offered tools and weapons to defend themselves in lawless times. He became both a threat to the warlords and a necessary evil, supplying arms when official channels failed or when a clan needed to arm itself discreetly. Still, he kept a careful distance from politics, never tying himself too closely to any one daimyo. If a lord pressed too hard, his shipments would mysteriously vanish, or a rival clan would suddenly find itself better armed. He manipulated the flow of weapons like a puppet master, never letting any single hand grasp the whole thread. Over time, rumors of the Shadow Forger grew. Stories of swords with unmatched sharpness appearing in battles far from his official forge, of defeated warriors whose blades bore marks unseen by any legal smithy. The hidden artisan thrived on secrecy. He maintained a life of deliberate modesty, living in a simple home, dressing as any other craftsman. To the outside world, he was a quiet, hardworking man, perhaps a little more prosperous than most, but still beneath notice. Meanwhile, his eyes and ears were everywhere. Innkeepers, traveling monks, even disgruntled samurai indebted to his network. Messages flowed through a web of trust and fear, encrypted in song, gesture, and symbol. His network's reach eventually shaped the course of local conflicts. Battles were decided not just by numbers or strategy, but by whose swords snapped in the thick of combat and whose cut true. Some believed he could pick the winners of skirmishes before the first arrow flew, simply by adjusting which clan received shipments first. Peasant uprisings, merchant feuds, even assassinations, all bore his invisible fingerprints. But his greatest challenge was not the law, nor the rival smiths, but the nature of secrecy itself. As his empire grew, so did the danger that someone in his network would betray him. To survive, he made loyalty a necessity, fostering a sense of shared purpose. Every member of the guild, from apprentice to courier, understood they lived or died together. He built in safeguards, secrets compartmentalized, no one person knowing everything. The law could crush individuals, but the network lived on, Hydra-like, each head capable of rebuilding the body. For decades, the artisan controlled arms across 5 provinces, moving beneath the noses of the very warlords who feared him most. He never owned land, never wore a crest, never claimed the title of lord, but the blades that drew the map of Japan were shaped by his hands. He was wealthier than many minor nobles, yet his fortune was the kind that could vanish with a whisper. In the end, his name faded, replaced by legend, but his legacy lived on every time a sword changed history. His story is a lesson for every age. True power is not always crowned or named. Sometimes the most dangerous empire is the one no one sees, built not on land or law, but on secrets, skill, and the willingness to risk everything for a vision no one else dared to imagine. When you hold a blade from that time, feel its balance and strength. Remember the hidden hands behind its creation, and the network that changed the fate of a nation from beneath the earth. The tea master who commanded generals. In a Japan riven by war, ambition, and unending quests for dominance, power was expected to be loud, a matter of battlefield victories, bloodlines, and loyalty sworn with the edge of a blade. Yet, at the very center of this violent chessboard, there emerged a quiet force who ruled not with a sword, but with a simple cup of tea. Senno Rikyu, born to a family of merchant artisans, could have lived a life in obscurity, forgotten among the tradesmen and craftspeople who served the samurai. But through devotion to his art, the Japanese tea ceremony, he rose to become the confidant of the era's greatest warlords, a man whose word carried as much weight as a general's command. This is the story of how one humble tea master held the fate of Japan in his calloused hands, and how his power, both subtle and absolute, would ultimately cost him his life. Senno Rikyu was born in 1522 in the merchant district of Sakai, a city prized for its culture and independent spirit. At a time when class was destiny, Rikyu's family background should have barred him from the world of daimyo and samurai. But the mid-16th century was an age of transformation, and the tea ceremony, once a pastime of the elite, had evolved into a potent symbol of taste, power, and politics. Rikyu apprenticed under masters of tea, immersing himself not just in the aesthetics of the ritual, but in the philosophy of wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection, humility, and transience. To him, every gesture mattered. Every silence in the tea room could be as decisive as a swing of a sword. His artistry was magnetic. Warlords vied for the honor of sharing tea with him. Under Oda Nobunaga, Rikyu became not just a tea master, but a counselor, trusted to orchestrate ceremonies where alliances were cemented, suspicions soothed, and betrayals sometimes quietly decided. In an era where the wrong word could mean death, Rikyu's tea room became neutral ground, a rare sanctuary where even mortal enemies sat face to face in ritualized calm. Nobunaga, the man who had burned temples and toppled dynasties, recognized the value of such a space. Through the tea ceremony, he could read rivals and cement his image as a cultured, invincible ruler. But Rikyu's greatest influence began under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant who had become supreme warlord after Nobunaga's assassination. Hideyoshi, unpredictable and hungry for legitimacy, found in Rikyu a man who could make or break reputations with a single invitation, or a single slight. The tea master choreographed gatherings of generals, princes, and monks. Each bowl of tea was an exercise in diplomacy, each silence a test of patience and self-mastery. The simple, rustic tea room, bare, humble, adorned only with a single flower or scroll, became the site of decisions that shaped the fate of the country. Rikyu believed in the radical idea that beauty, simplicity, and inner harmony could tame even the most savage ambitions. In his presence, the greatest warlords submitted themselves to ritual, to humility, and sometimes to self-reflection. He had the audacity to teach even Hideyoshi restraint, advising that true power lay not in ostentation, but in the discipline of emptiness. But with influence comes risk. As Rikyu's fame grew, so did the envy and suspicion surrounding him. Hideyoshi, once his greatest patron, began to fear that the tea master was too revered, his inner circle too loyal, his power too invisible to be controlled. The tension between them was as subtle as it was deadly. Rikyu's insistence on humility clashed with Hideyoshi's thirst for grandeur. When Hideyoshi commissioned a golden tea room, a display of power and wealth, Rikyu responded with silent disapproval, subtly mocking the warlord's vanity. In a society built on face and honor, such gestures were dangerous. Rikyu's refusal to flatter, his uncompromising vision of simplicity, began to look like rebellion. Rumors grew that the tea master was using his influence to shape the political landscape. His disciples included lords and military men, all schooled in his philosophy of calm judgment and controlled ambition. To Hideyoshi, this network felt like a rival court, a silent rebellion brewing beneath the ritual of tea. The final break came abruptly. In 1591, Hideyoshi ordered Rikyu to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, on grounds that were never made fully public. Some said it was a personal slight. Others whispered of conspiracies or secret alliances forged in the tea room's shadows. On the day of his death, Rikyu performed one final tea ceremony for his closest followers. He composed a death poem, arranged the implements with meticulous care, and then, with the same serenity he'd shown all his life, ended his own. The message was unmistakable. Even stripped of every worldly possession, even at the edge of death, the mastery of the self remained unbroken. Senno Rikyu's influence did not die with him. The tea room, once seen as a place of quiet leisure, had become a crucible for political power. Warlords, generals, and even emperors would forever after seek legitimacy, not just through conquest, but through the subtle arts of culture, humility, and controlled ritual. The tea ceremony, as Rikyu defined it, remains one of Japan's most enduring legacies, a space where power is measured not in force, but in restraint. The tale of Sen no Rikyu is not just about the triumph of art over violence. It is a warning about the dangers of invisible power, the kind that cannot be seized or threatened, only respected or feared. In a land of warriors, the quietest man in the room commanded the loudest authority. His mastery was not just of tea, but of the human spirit, and that is why, even centuries later, his shadow still falls across the tatami mats where history was made, one bowl at a time. The peasant rebellion that shook the shogunate. In the cold, battered winter of 1637, as Japan's rigid social order ground the lives of millions beneath the weight of hierarchy and tax, the world's most unexpected army began to gather. They were not samurai, nor even minor lords, just poor farmers and fishermen, rice tenants and orphaned children, battered by the unending storm of debt, hunger, and the violence of authority. Yet within the volcanic valleys of Shimabara and the windswept plains of Amakusa, these common people did the unthinkable. They dared to rise. It began with suffering so ordinary that it almost escaped notice. The peasants of Shimabara had always been poor, but under the rule of Matsukura Shigemasa, their misery reached its breaking point. The shogunate demanded not only loyalty and order, but ever-increasing taxes, silver, rice, and, as the Christian faith had crept in from beyond the seas, the absolute denial of any belief but what the shogun allowed. Villages groaned beneath the weight of new castles, forced labor, and brutal punishments for those who failed to deliver. Children starved, parents despaired, and hope itself seemed taxed beyond its limits. To Matsukura and his officials, the peasants were numbers on a ledger, resources to be squeezed dry for the glory of the Lord. But to the peasants themselves, when each day's sunrise was a fresh negotiation between endurance and collapse. Rice fields froze, taxes doubled, and the secret police prowled with lists and whips. For some, the silent prayers whispered at night became acts of defiance. For others, hunger simply overpowered fear. By late autumn, the line was crossed. A peasant woman, suspected of withholding taxes, was tortured to death. Word spread through the villages like wildfire, each new atrocity fueling a rising anger. There was no grand speech, no manifesto, just 1,000 small promises, whispered in the dark. Enough. Out of the snow and mud, armed with farming tools, rusty swords, and stolen matchlocks, the peasants gathered. They elected unlikely leaders, some barely more than boys, and crowned their faith with hope in the figure of Amakusa Shiro, a teenage Christian who became, for a brief moment, a beacon of the impossible. In December, banners unfurled. Peasants and persecuted Christians alike took up arms. They stormed tax offices, burned records, and struck down the local samurai who had so long lorded over their suffering. Like a sudden storm, villages that had survived on submission transformed into fortresses of resistance. As news spread, thousands flocked to the rebel cause. Women and children included, carrying not only weapons but the battered artifacts of forbidden faith. Across the valleys, the voices of the oppressed rose in prayer and war cry alike. The shogunate, at first, dismissed the uprising as just another peasant disturbance. But as villages fell and the Matsukura castle itself trembled, fear grew in Edo. This was no minor rebellion. This was a mass defiance, a shattering of the order that had kept power in the hands of the few and misery on the backs of the many. The Bakufu dispatched armies, first hundreds, then thousands, hardened samurai wielding the full authority of the state. Cornered, the rebels retreated to Hara Castle, a windswept fortress perched above the sea. Within its crumbling walls, nearly 40,000 souls, farmers, outcasts, women, and children, prepared for the last stand. The siege began, brutal and absolute. For months, the shogunate's armies battered the walls, launching fire and steel, choking out water and food. Yet the rebels refused to yield. Songs of faith and hope echoed over the blood-soaked battlements as mothers passed stories to their children and fathers sharpened the last of their makeshift blades. But starvation is an enemy no courage can withstand forever. As the winter deepened, hunger gnawed through hope. Supplies ran dry, and the cold crept in. Inside the castle, rebels faced the final horror, the knowledge that no rescue would come. Still they endured, proving to the very end that the will of the downtrodden could shake even the most unyielding order. In the spring of 1638, the walls finally fell. The samurai flooded through, slaughtering nearly every rebel in their path. Amakusa Shiro, the boy messiah of the uprising, was captured and executed, his head displayed for all to see, a warning and a symbol. The shogunate had crushed the rebellion, but in its triumph, it uncovered a terror that would never truly sleep again. What the rulers saw was not simply a defeated enemy. They saw the nightmare of their own making, the realization that power pressed too hard could drive even the meekest to revolution. In the aftermath, the shogunate enacted harsh new laws, banning Christianity outright, tightening surveillance, and building a state defined by fear. But for all the punishments and edicts, the ghost of Shimabara haunted the elite. Every peasant village, every whispered rumor became a potential spark. The rulers learned to dread not only the strength of arms, but the power of hunger and hope. And though the rebels were dead, their memory could not be erased. Parents told the story of Hara Castle in secret, passing it from tongue to tongue as a warning and a vow, that even those who have nothing can change the course of history, even if only for a moment. The Shimabara rebellion showed that beneath the rigid layers of law and custom, Japan's peasants were never truly powerless. They could bleed, they could fight, and for a brief and terrible season, they could shake the world. In the years that followed, the lessons of Shimabara shaped the soul of the nation. The shogunate endured, but with new cracks beneath its surface, forever glancing over its shoulder, forever afraid that in some cold winter, the cry of the people might once again rise, and the impossible become real. The merchant who bought a samurai name. In the bustling streets of Edo period Japan, the divide between merchant and samurai was more than just a line. It was a wall, centuries thick, fortified by law, custom, and suspicion. Yet beneath the veneer of order and honor, ambition always found cracks to slip through. This is the true, almost unbelievable story of a merchant family who bought a samurai name, forged an identity, and for 3 generations lived in the shadows of a lie so perfect it fooled an entire society, until the day everything unraveled. To understand the magnitude of their deception, you must first step into the world they longed to escape. Merchants, despite their growing wealth, stood at the very bottom of the official hierarchy. Samurai, often impoverished but wrapped in prestige, lived above them, allowed to carry swords, own land, and walk with a pride no merchant could claim. Merchants could build fortunes, but never buy status. At least, not legally. But money has its own gravity. In the late 17th century, the Tokugawa shogunate's grip was tight, but its bureaucracy was not immune to corruption or blind spots. Wealthy merchant houses began quietly seeking ways to elevate themselves. The most ambitious among them did more than simply bribe officials for small favors. They aimed higher. They wanted the right to wear the swords of a samurai, to enter shrines reserved for the warrior class, to send their sons to elite schools, and to marry into noble families. For this, they needed not just wealth, but a name, a lineage. One such merchant, clever and relentless, set his plan in motion. He tracked down a miner impoverished by a branch of a samurai clan, whose only remaining asset was their family name. Over clandestine meetings and secret payments, the deal was struck. In exchange for a fortune, the merchant received the rights to use the family's name. But a name alone was not enough. With the help of forgers, scribes skilled in calligraphy, and even monks willing to bend their vows, he commissioned a set of meticulously crafted lineage scrolls. These documents, aged and smudged for authenticity, traced his family back through generations of warriors and battles, weaving his ancestors into the fabric of samurai legend. The transformation was not immediate. For years, the family kept a low profile, slowly adopting the customs, dress, and speech of the warrior class. They enrolled their sons in kenjutsu schools, learned the rituals of the tea ceremony, and hired tutors to instruct them in the art of the brush. In public, they walked with the measured dignity of samurai, their swords always in place. Every festival, every public gathering was a test of their performance. They played their roles so well that soon even the neighbors believed the myth. Generations passed. Sons inherited not only the business, but also the burden of secrecy. Each child was raised on 2 histories, the real one whispered behind closed doors, and the official one recited at every public gathering. They attended samurai gatherings, married daughters of minor lords, and donated to temples, all while maintaining strict discipline in their manner and speech. For 3 generations, the deception held. But the higher they climbed, the more dangerous the game became. The family's success drew envy, suspicion, and eventually scrutiny. Rivals, real samurai whose fortunes had declined, or jealous merchants, began to whisper, how had this family risen so quickly? Why were there no stories of their ancestors among the old warriors? In an age obsessed with pedigree, the tiniest inconsistency could spark an investigation. It was a single mistake, a misremembered ancestor's name at a public shrine, that triggered the fall. An aging retainer loyal to a rival clan overheard the error. He began to dig, tracing records and old temple registers. Slowly, the truth emerged. The earliest records of the family simply did not exist. The scrolls, when examined by true experts, revealed minute errors, a signature style not yet invented when the document was supposed to have been written, a battle mentioned that occurred before the supposed ancestor was born. Word reached the authorities. The family, once embraced as samurai, was summoned to answer for their lineage. In a society obsessed with face and reputation, exposure was not just a personal disaster, but a public humiliation that could ruin those who had married into the family, those who had done business with them, and even the officials who had vouched for their authenticity. Punishments could be severe: loss of property, public disgrace, even exile. The family's fortune evaporated overnight, their names stricken from the records. their descendants cast out from both the world of merchants and that of warriors. Yet, the scandal echoed far beyond their fall. It revealed the fragility of a system built on appearance and tradition. How many others, people whispered, had bought names, forged identities, or hidden their true origins behind a veneer of paper and silk? The Shogunate's investigators redoubled their efforts, scouring records, punishing forgers, and tightening the walls around the samurai class. But the damage was done. The story entered popular legend, retold in tea houses and woodblock prints, as a warning and a fascination, a parable of ambition, illusion, and the cost of crossing boundaries meant to be unbreakable. Behind the drama, though, lies something deeper. For in a world where a merchant could become a samurai with the right documents, the very meaning of class and honor became a performance, not a destiny. The family's rise and fall exposed the uneasy truth that what people believed about themselves and each other could be rewritten, at least for a time, by nothing more than ink, memory, and desire. So in the end, the merchant who bought a samurai name won and lost everything. His descendants learned that in a society obsessed with what is written, sometimes the greatest power and the greatest risk lies in the stories people tell about who they are. For 3 generations, they lived a life denied to most, walking a tightrope above the abyss. When the truth came out, it was not just a family, but an entire way of thinking that was forced to reckon with the thin line between reality and reputation, a line easily crossed, but never uncrossed. The Geisha who manipulated domain politics. The city of Edo shimmered with secrets. Lantern light reflected on wet stone, laughter echoing down narrow alleys, the scent of incense curling through shoji doors. Beneath the formal etiquette of samurai and the rigid codes of clan and loyalty, there was a subtler game being played, a game of rumor, seduction, and ambition, where power did not always wear a sword. In this city of masks and rituals, the geisha was an artist of a different order. Her instrument was not the shamisen alone, but the human heart, the vulnerable pride of men trained to trust only steel. In the annals of Japan's secret history, there is a story whispered by those who knew the true currents of power, the tale of a geisha who altered the fate of 2 domains with nothing more than a well-placed word and the delicate tilt of a fan. Her name was never recorded in the official scrolls. To the commoners, she was simply the most gifted geisha of her district, acclaimed for her beauty, her wit, her ability to turn a room of rivals into allies or adversaries with a laugh or a glance. But to those who paid attention, it became clear that her talents stretched far beyond the tea house stage. She moved through the world of daimyo and courtiers like an invisible hand, shifting alliances with gestures and whispers, making herself both indispensable and impossible to fully trust. It was a time of uneasy peace, but beneath the surface, the old rivalries between domains pulsed as fiercely as ever. 2 lords, one from the northern mountains, the other from the southern rice plains, were locked in a tense negotiation over land, water, and tribute. Each lord was proud, each surrounded by advisors and spies, each wary of betraying the slightest weakness. Yet both came, in their time, to the same tea house in Edo, where the elite gathered for politics disguised as pleasure. The geisha watched and listened, offering songs and stories, tea and smiles, her every movement calculated to lower defenses, to make the powerful forget how carefully they were being observed. She remembered every word, every offhand remark about family and fortune, every complaint whispered after too much sake. She learned before the lords themselves the hidden insecurities that drove them, the old wounds, the desperate ambitions, the small humiliations that festered into vendetta. She knew, too, how to move information without leaving a trail. Sometimes a careless joke during a walks would plant a seed of doubt about an advisor's loyalty. Sometimes a seemingly innocent question, "Why does your lord look so tired lately?" would spark suspicion. She arranged chance meetings, ensured that certain servants overheard certain remarks, set rumor against rumor until no one was quite sure who had said what or why. Through the seasons, her influence grew. Both lords came to rely on her, not only for company, but for insight. She offered each man exactly what he needed to hear. To one, reassurance that his rival was anxious and uncertain. To the other, warnings that his own advisors might be swayed by bribes or threats. She never lied outright. She simply curated the truth, selecting, omitting, shading, so that each man believed he alone had glimpsed the reality behind the mask. Behind closed doors, gifts began to appear. Fine silk, gold coins, invitations to private audiences. The geisha accepted everything with a smile and offered nothing concrete in return, only the promise that she could, if asked, arrange an introduction, deliver a letter, relay a subtle warning. Her real skill was in knowing what to say and when to say nothing at all. In time, the territorial negotiations reached a stalemate. Both lords grew paranoid, suspecting betrayal not only from each other, but from within their own ranks. The geisha, meanwhile, orchestrated her own subtle campaign. She encouraged the lords to trust her as their only confidant, feeding each just enough information to fuel suspicion, but never enough to spark outright war. It was a delicate dance. One slip, and she would have been ruined or worse. But she moved with perfect precision, always one step ahead. Finally, the day came when a new territorial agreement was struck, a compromise that benefited neither lord as much as they had hoped, but one that left both convinced they had avoided disaster only because of a timely warning from their most trusted ally, the geisha. In reality, she had engineered the deadlock herself, using whispers and suggestions to ensure that each side made just enough concessions to keep the other satisfied, while sowing enough doubt to prevent either from moving too boldly. When the negotiations ended, both lords sent secret payments, thank yous, tributes, silent bribes, to the tea house, each believing the geisha had secured their victory. She accepted the payments with the same grace she brought to every performance, hiding her triumph behind a mask of humility. She had no official power, no lands, no armies, but for a brief moment, she had been the true sovereign of the room, the hidden axis around which two domains revolved. As for the geisha herself, she never claimed credit. She vanished from Edo's high society as mysteriously as she had entered, leaving behind only stories, some adoring, some scandalous, all tinged with awe and envy. The lords returned to their domains, never fully certain how their secrets had been exposed, or how their enemy always seemed to know their next move. Some say the geisha retired to a distant province, investing her fortune and living out her days in comfort. Others insist she simply changed her name and continued to shape the course of history from behind the paper screens of another city. But her legend endured, growing with every telling. In the chronicles of Edo, there were lords who wielded swords, monks who wielded prayers, merchants who wielded gold. But it was the geisha, unarmed, unseen, underestimated, who, for one pivotal season, held the balance of power in her painted hands, showing that in the game of empires, the greatest weapon of all was the ability to listen, to shape belief, and to vanish with the secret that made the world move. In a world obsessed with honor and lineage, it was the voice of the outsider, the artist of innuendo, the master of the unsaid, who redrew the lines, leaving history to wonder who truly held the power in Edo's flickering light. The actor who lived a double life as a spy. Imagine the world behind the mask, the painted faces, the sudden thunder of the drums, the flash of colored silk swirling on a candlelit stage. In Edo-era Japan, the kabuki theater was more than just entertainment. It was a feverish escape for merchants, samurai, and townsfolk alike. But to the ruling elite, kabuki actors were little more than outcasts, brilliant in performance, despised in status, kept firmly at the edge of society. No one expected these men to shape the fate of empires. But sometimes history moves on the edge of a knife, and the greatest actor is the one who convinces you he is no one at all. He was known by many names, but his true one is lost to time. In the shadowed quarters of the city, he was a star, his voice able to shatter the hush of an audience, his movements so mesmerizing that samurai sometimes dropped their masks of stoic reserve just to watch him breathe life into a new role. Beneath the stage lights, he could be a beggar, a noble, a ghost, a woman, a god. But off stage, he was invisible, just another member of a profession regarded as unworthy, forever outside the bounds of polite society. Yet it was precisely this invisibility, this art of transformation, that drew the attention of the Tokugawa shogunate. Power in Edo Japan was as much a game of shadows as of swords, And information was the deadliest weapon of all. The shogun and his advisors watched the great daimyos, the regional lords, always searching for signs of rebellion, conspiracy, or secret alliances. And who better to slip unnoticed through the courts and city streets than an actor, a master of disguise, deception, and human nature? The offer was made in secret, perhaps delivered in the dead of night, behind the stage curtains after a show. Gold for loyalty, protection for silence, and a dangerous promise. Act for the shogun, and all the doors closed to your kind would open. The actor accepted, not only for the reward, but for the thrill. All his life he'd worn masks to survive. Now his survival depended on his greatest role yet. He became a shadow on the move. At the theater, he played the tragic hero, the comic fool, the cunning villain. But when the performance ended and the crowd spilled into the darkness, his real work began. Disguised as a servant, he moved among the powerful in the capital's great mansions. As a wandering merchant, he passed unnoticed through market crowds, overhearing talk of plans, shipments, and betrayals. He could vanish into a monk's robes, slip into the gardens of the imperial court, or serve wine at secret banquets, blending so perfectly that even those who looked into his eyes failed to recognize him. He learned to memorize not just lines, but whispered secrets: who was plotting with whom, which samurai drank too much, which concubines carried messages for their lords. He sent information back to his Tokugawa handlers, sometimes as coded phrases slipped into his stage performances, sometimes as poems, sometimes in the patterns of flowers gifted after a show. The smallest gesture, the most innocent phrase, could signal a new threat or a shift in power. His world was danger layered upon danger. If his true work were ever discovered, the consequences would be death, immediate, merciless, and silent. Even among his fellow actors, he could trust no one. Paranoia became part of the script. He rehearsed not only for the stage, but for the streets, practicing new identities, new voices, new ways of moving through the world as someone else. Each day, the lines between his real self and his roles blurred, until even he was unsure where the performance ended. But the rewards were real. The shogun kept his promises. Gold flowed discreetly, land was granted under an assumed name, and whispers of the actor's influence spread through Edo's secret channels. He became a ghost of power, never seen but felt in every sudden change of fortune, every intercepted letter, every failed plot. Rival daimyos were arrested in the dead of night. Uprisings were quashed before a single sword was drawn. And always behind these sudden moves was the silent hand of the actor, scripting the downfall of those who threatened the peace. As years passed, the kabuki stage became his only sanctuary, a place where lies were safe because everyone knew they were fiction. On nights of political turmoil, his performances took on a new electricity. The audience never guessed that behind every mask was a man who had stolen secrets from their lords, altered the fate of provinces, and dined with both rebels and rulers. They saw only the flawless illusion, the living embodiment of art and danger. When his story finally faded, as all legends do, the shogunate's hold on Japan was stronger than ever. The actor vanished from the records, his wealth passed on in silence, his land holdings masked by layers of loyal intermediaries. In time, other spies took up the cloak of invisibility, but none matched the subtlety of the actor who used every mask, every role, every breath to walk the razor's edge between theater and treason. And so, in the soft glow of the lanterns, as the music swells and the curtain rises, remember, sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is not the one with a sword, but the one whose true face you never see, a master of illusion who changed history, one performance at a time. The fisherman who became a pirate king. In the shadowed coves and fog-laced islets of Japan's Sato Inland Sea, history's tides shaped destinies both great and humble. Here, far from the shining courts and blood-soaked battlefields of samurai legend, a different kind of story took root, a story where survival, not honor, was the ultimate code, and a single fisherman could, through grit and cunning, rise from poverty to a throne built not on land, but on the rolling, lawless waves. This is the true saga of the fisherman who became a pirate king, a man whose name, though nearly lost to the tides, once struck fear across the inland sea, challenging daimyo and shogun alike. The Seto Inland Sea, with its labyrinth of islands and shifting channels, was both a lifeline and a trap for those who lived along its shores. For generations, its people were fishermen, humble, hard-working, and mostly invisible to the great lords. But as Japan's feudal order hardened in the late medieval era, these fishermen found themselves squeezed by a tightening net of taxes, tolls, and corrupt officials. Inland waters, once open to all, were now patrolled and claimed by rival samurai clans. Fishermen who couldn't pay bribes saw their boats seized or their families left hungry. At first, defiance was simple: a refusal to pay, a boat launched in darkness, a hidden catch sold behind the backs of tacksmen. But repression bred desperation, and soon small bands of rebellious fishermen began striking back, not just slipping through the cracks, but actively sabotaging the officials who hunted them. Boats were burned, patrols attacked, and rumors began to swirl of a mysterious leader emerging among these outlaws, one who understood the sea better than any warrior, and who united desperate men into something stronger than mere criminals: a brotherhood. This leader was said to have been born in a poor fishing village, his real name replaced by whispers and fear. He was no samurai, had no bloodline to speak of, but he learned early that mastery of the sea could make even the lowliest man a king in his own domain. The pirate king's genius was not brute force, but organization. He built a fleet from stolen boats and desperate men, creating a strict code: loyalty to the crew, spoils shared, and violence used only when necessary. On land, he would have been crushed. On water, he became untouchable. These pirates, sometimes called keizoku, knew every hidden cove, every current, every weakness in the naval patrols. They struck with precision, attacking merchant ships, collecting protection fees, and even negotiating ransoms. Local villagers, themselves victims of samurai tax collectors, often turned a blind eye or quietly cheered the pirates on, seeing them as the only force willing to fight the overlords. In the chaos of the Sengoku period, when warlords were too busy fighting each other to police the waves, the pirate king's domain grew unchecked. With time, this fisherman-turned-pirate grew bold enough to challenge the very samurai clans who had driven him to the sea. He formed alliances with rival lords, trading protection or information in exchange for safe harbors and supplies. Some daimyo found it more profitable to hire the pirates than to fight them, turning these once hunted men into shadowy power brokers. The pirate king became a legend, equal parts villain and hero, feared by merchants, courted by warlords, and mythologized by peasants. But piracy came with a price. The shogunate, once firmly established, saw the pirate fleets as a threat to its fragile monopoly on power and commerce. Naval patrols were strengthened, bounties placed on the pirate king's head, and betrayals grew frequent as gold changed hands in the shadows. Yet for years the king and his fleet evaded capture, always vanishing into the mists of the islands, always one step ahead. The legacy of this fisherman-pirate king endures in more than just legends. His reign forced Japan's rulers to rethink how power moved along the coasts and waterways. In time, the Seto Inland Sea would be pacified and the pirates suppressed, but the memory lingered of a time when the lowliest fishermen could challenge the greatest lords, when desperation turned to defiance, and when the waves themselves answered to a king with calloused hands and a commoner's resolve. His story is a testament to the truth that history's greatest changes don't always begin in castles or palaces. Sometimes revolution begins in the rhythm of wars, in the hush of dawn before a raid, in the courage to defy a world built to keep you small. The fisherman who became a pirate king is more than a legend. He is a reminder that beneath the surface of every order, there is a tide waiting to rise, and that the line between outlaw and ruler can vanish like a footprint in the sand, washed away by the sea that gave him his crown. The samurai's servant who avenged his master. In the shadowed corridors of feudal Japan, where every stone whispered of loyalty and betrayal, there is a story rarely told outside the hushed circles of servants and street storytellers. It is not the tale of a famous general or the rise of a great daimyo. Instead, it is the story of a man whose very station was meant to render him invisible. A servant whose quiet hands would one day carry the weight of honor and vengeance. rewriting the rules of power and justice. His master was a samurai, respected in the province, known for his unwavering sense of right and wrong. But in the world beneath the cherry blossoms and crested helmets, justice was easily bent by the men who truly controlled the fates of others. Magistrates, appointed by distant lords, who wielded their authority as both shield and sword. One such man was Magistrate Takeda, a figure whose corruption was so deeply rooted that even those who despised him dared only to whisper his name. Bribes flowed like water. Enemies disappeared as if swept into the sea. The samurai, bound by duty and pride, confronted this rot and paid the ultimate price. A trumped-up charge, a sham trial, and an order for death by seppuku. The province mourned, but only in silence. The samurai's death was a message, one that cowed rivals and cowed friends alike. Yet in the darkness behind the funeral rites, a single candle still burned. The samurai's servant, his attendant in life, his shadow in death, could not let go. Servants in this age were expected to fade into the background, their grief quiet and their loyalty easily forgotten. Yet to this man, loyalty was not just a word, but a reason to exist. Day and night he replayed the events, tracing each step that led to his master's ruin. He saw the magistrate's smug indifference, the cruel machinery of false justice, and he vowed that the scales would be balanced, one way or another. Unlike samurai, servants were not bound by the code of Bushido in the same way. There were no elaborate rituals of honor to observe, no fealty oaths to break. The law did not regard them with the same suspicion as armed warriors, nor expect them to defend the name of their household. In that invisibility lay a strange, powerful freedom, a freedom the servant would soon wield with terrifying resolve. His preparation was slow and methodical. By day, he worked in a new household, scrubbing floors, fetching water, listening to gossip that flowed freely in kitchens and back alleys. By night, he returned to the shrine where his master's spirit was honored, whispering his intent in the language of the lost. He watched the magistrate's habits, learned his routes, mapped the rhythms of his retinue, the changing of his guards, the moments when even the most powerful man was alone. The magistrate, fat on impunity, never saw the threat. He mistook the servant's poverty for impotence, his silence for stupidity. But there is a special clarity that comes to those with nothing left to lose. The servant bided his time through bitter seasons, through the hunger of winter and the mud of spring, until the day arrived when the magistrate's guard was thinnest, his arrogance greatest, his fate sealed by the weight of his own contempt. On that evening, beneath the shroud of a rainstorm, the servant made his move. Disguised as a lowly errand runner, he slipped into the magistrate's residence as the household bustled with a night of feasting. The guards, drunk and distracted, barely glanced at the shadow in the corridor. The magistrate, alone in his study, was caught between the clatter of celebration and the tedium of paperwork. He did not look up until it was too late. The confrontation was quick, silent, and absolute. There was no speech, no warning, no melodrama, just a flash of steel, the grunt of mortal shock, and the sudden hush that follows a secret set free. The magistrate fell, struck down not by a rival samurai, but by the hand of a man whose loyalty had outlived his master. The servant wiped his blade clean, collected himself, and with the same humility he had shown all his life, melted into the night. Panic erupted the next morning. The guards found the magistrate lifeless, the household thrown into chaos. Officials scoured the city, interrogating every servant, arresting any who seemed suspicious. But the killer had vanished. Some claimed he escaped dressed as a pilgrim, walking the mountain roads. Others whispered he drowned himself in the river, completing his duty by vanishing forever from the world of the living. No one ever saw him again. The authorities, embarrassed by the failure of their justice, quietly closed the case. The people, however, did not forget. In alleyways and tea houses, the story was told and retold. A tale of vengeance carried out by the least likely of men. But this is not just a story of revenge. It is a story of the invisible, the overlooked, the underestimated, those who serve quietly while others command loudly. The servant's act shattered the illusion that only the mighty could strike at the heart of power. He showed that the bonds of loyalty are not the property of any class or title. that honor is not dictated by birth, and that even in a world ordered by rigid law, there is always a shadow in which justice can be reborn. Long after, in villages and towns, people would invoke the story not to glorify violence, but to remind themselves of the hidden power carried by the meek. It became a cautionary tale to those in authority. Do not mistake silence for submission or poverty for weakness. The servant, whose name was never recorded, became a legend among the forgotten, a symbol that true loyalty does not end with death, and that sometimes justice comes from the place you least expect. In this way, the servant avenged not only his master, but all who had ever been silenced by the machinery of power. He became, for a fleeting moment, the hand of fate itself, then faded into the world's memory, a ghost whose story lingers whenever injustice tries to hide behind the masks of order and law. The peasant woman who became a castle steward. She was born in a thatched hut where the dirt floor grew cold in winter and the wind howled through cracks with little mercy. In her village, women had little chance for more than survival. Yet she watched her father work as a bailiff for the local manor, taking mental notes on every tally, every bargain struck for grain or tax, every trick to keep peace between hungry peasants and the demands of distant lords. When plague and famine swept through, her father died, her mother wasted away, and her younger siblings were scattered to distant relatives. Left alone, she learned that in feudal Japan, mercy seldom came from above. Ambition, if she dared, had to be hidden. As a girl, her fate was set: marriage to a struggling farmer, servitude, perhaps an early grave. But she was clever and daring in ways the world did not reward. When a recruiting agent came to the village seeking servants for the castle of a minor daimyo, she bound her chest, cut her hair, borrowed her dead brother's name in threadbare clothing, and presented herself as a boy. The overseer, more interested in able hands than pretty faces, accepted her without question. Thus began her life under a new name, working in the shadowed halls of a world forbidden to women. The castle was no palace of gold and glory. It was a cramped stronghold of stone and timber, perched on a lonely ridge, run by a clan with more pride than wealth. The steward's post was a web of endless duties: managing food stores, supervising repairs, settling quarrels between warriors and laborers, and negotiating with merchants who always scented desperation. Most failed in exhaustion or were caught embezzling. But the new boy servant moved through tasks with silent precision, anticipating needs before they became disasters, smoothing tempers, quietly covering for the Lord's rash decisions. When the old steward took ill, she stepped into his shoes, running the castle's daily life so seamlessly that even the daimyo took notice. For years, she rose quietly in rank, always careful to keep her disguise. She slept in servants' quarters, took meals alone, and avoided the hot springs and sake feasts where secrets might slip. Her mind became her armor. She memorized accounts, learned to read and write in secret, and even studied the scrolls of clan law at night by candlelight, risking severe punishment if discovered. The Lord's trusted men began to defer to her judgment, and soon she was handling not only supplies and construction, but also sensitive negotiations, sometimes even corresponding with other stewards, always under her borrowed male name. Rumors swirled about the young steward's unusual intelligence, quiet manner, and almost uncanny ability to predict trouble. Some said he had no family, others joked he was a spirit sent by the ancestors to protect the clan. She kept her head down, never laughing too loud or making friends too quickly, always walking the narrow edge between caution and ambition. She knew one mistake would end not just her career, but her life. The castle was not a forgiving place. Female servants risked beatings for mere disobedience, let alone for daring to claim a man's role. It was a minor slip that brought her secret to light, a wound that would not heal, the wrong answer to a question about her past, a loose remark from an old village neighbor. Word reached the daimyo's wife, and a confrontation could not be avoided. In another time, in another castle, she would have been executed without question. The samurai code demanded strict punishment for such deception, especially from a woman who had invaded a male domain. But the world had changed since the day she arrived. The castle was no longer on the brink of famine. The books were in order. The staff respected her. The Lord's allies credited her with saving the estate from ruin. And perhaps the daimyo, a pragmatic man who valued survival over pride, saw what the loss of such an effective steward would mean. So, in the dead of night, after a brief council, the decision was made. She would not be punished, not formally. She would remain in her post, but her name would be erased from all records, her true identity hidden forever. There would be no celebration, no tale told in the village, no mention in the clan scrolls. She would exist only as a ghost in the castle's history, a necessary presence, an invisible hand, never to be acknowledged. Her story was whispered among servants and later among other women who dared to dream of something beyond their station. Some said she lived out her years as steward, dying quietly after decades of service. Others believed she left the castle eventually, living under a new name, vanishing into the anonymity she had worn so skillfully. The truth, like so many stories of unrecorded lives, is lost to time. But what remains is a single indelible fact. For years, a woman ruled the heart of a samurai's stronghold, her intelligence and resolve rewriting the possibilities for all who came after. In a society built on rigid hierarchy and unbending rules, she became a ghost in the castle's memory. Proof that sometimes the most remarkable lives are those erased from the scrolls, but not from history itself. Her legacy is silent but powerful, a defiance of the fate imposed on her, an invisible revolution in the quiet corridors of power. The steward whose real name was never spoken out loud, but whose story, if you listen closely, still echoes in the stones of forgotten castles across Japan. The monk who ran an illegal banking network. The world remembers temples as places of peace. Silent courtyards, incense smoke curling beneath painted eaves, chants rising at dawn from hidden rooms. In medieval Japan, the temple was more than sanctuary. It was a city within a city, guarded by law, mystery, and the weight of tradition. But sometimes, beneath the tranquil surface, ambition brewed stronger than any prayer. In the annals of forbidden history, there is the tale of a monk who turned sanctuary into syndicate, robes into robes of office, and prayer beads into the quiet click of currency moving beneath the tatami mats. His true name, now lost, began in the ordinary way. A boy orphaned by famine, accepted at a minor temple whose fortunes depended on the generosity of local lords and the loyalty of humble villagers. The temple promised food, purpose, and a path to enlightenment. The boy grew into a monk, mastering not only the sutras, but the mathematics of rice and silver, the ledgers that recorded every gift, every debt, every ounce of fortune passing through sacred hands. By the time he inherited the abbacy, he saw what others could not. The hunger and risk that gripped his province. Farmers scraped at thin soil, forever one step ahead of ruin. Merchants, forbidden to hold too much influence, worked the margins of legality, forced to borrow at crushing rates from official moneylenders or the cold hands of government banks. The shogunate controlled commerce with an iron fist, making sure power flowed uphill to the samurai and not downward to the people who fed them. Even the temple felt the squeeze. Donations waned in hard years, repairs delayed, novices sent home when the coffers emptied. The monk watched. He listened. He saw desperation in every supplicant's eyes, and he realized that where there was hunger, there was opportunity. Not just for profit, but for the kind of leverage no sword could buy. With the authority of his robes and the trust his order commanded, the monk began his experiment. Quietly at first, he offered small loans to farmers, grain in spring, silver at planting time, forgiveness of debt if the floods came or the tax collector struck too hard. The interest was modest, far less than the merchants or the government dared charge. Word spread. Fields began to recover. Merchants arrived, hat in hand, asking for advances on goods yet to be delivered. What began as charity soon became a network. The monk wrote ledgers in secret, encrypting names with symbols so only trusted initiates could interpret them. Temple messengers, posing as pilgrims, delivered money and collected payments across the region. The temple's storehouses, once only for rice and sacred texts, now sheltered collateral, jewelry, deeds, family heirlooms. Each transaction brought gratitude, loyalty, and in time, a subtle shift in the balance of local power. The monk was careful. He never refused an official visitor. He blessed the crops, led the festivals, and offered prayers for the health of the daimyo. Outwardly, the temple changed little. Bells rang, incense burned, novices swept the stone steps. But at night, the abbot and his inner circle pored over accounts, tracking flows of money with the precision of any government ministry. When borrowers faltered, the monk forgave debts with public generosity, earning a reputation for saintly kindness. In private, he calculated risk and reward, knowing every favor was a future investment. The impact rippled outward. Peasants built sturdier homes, merchants expanded their businesses. Even minor samurai found themselves borrowing, quietly, shamefaced, but unable to resist the monk's terms. As more sought the temple's help, the government banks found their own clients vanishing. Tax revenues dipped. Whispers began to circulate. How could a monk offer better rates than the shogun himself? Whose interest did this charity truly serve? Inevitably, suspicion found its way to the authorities. An official inquiry was launched. Agents visited the temple in disguise, attending rituals, posing as desperate peasants, seeking evidence of corruption or fraud. But the monk's network was airtight. Transactions were masked as offerings. Contracts were oral, sealed with ritual and trust, never inked on scrolls that could be confiscated. The temple's outer calm remained undisturbed, even as its underground empire grew. But as the monk's influence widened, so did the danger. Rivals at court, bankers, ministers, even other temples, resented the power he wielded. The government, threatened by any force outside its control, prepared to strike. One spring morning, as cherry blossoms fell across the courtyard, a detachment of soldiers arrived, bearing orders for the monk's arrest. The temple's followers gathered to protest, but resistance was useless against imperial decree. The monk was accused not of theft, but of subverting the social order, of offering hope where only obedience was meant to thrive, of redrawing the map of obligation and power. In a rare show of public trial, the government forced the monk to account for his actions. He spoke plainly that his loans saved families from ruin, that the temple's prosperity flowed back into the community, that true faith was measured not in silver, but in the lives uplifted by compassion and courage. His words moved many, but the verdict was preordained. He was exiled, stripped of office, sent far from the province he had reshaped. The illegal banking network was dissolved, officially. But the echo of what the monk built could not be so easily erased. Grateful farmers and merchants repaid their debts not to the new temple authorities, but to each other, creating informal bonds of credit and trust. Novices who had learned from the monk carried his methods in secret, rebuilding networks wherever they traveled. In some villages, the monk's exile was mourned like the death of a patron saint. In others, he became a legend, a caution, an inspiration, a symbol of what happens when mercy dares to outmaneuver power. As for the monk himself, stories diverge. Some say he lived out his days teaching mathematics and ethics in a distant town. Others that he was quietly recalled by sympathetic lords to advise on finance and policy. But wherever his spirit lingered, the world he left behind bore his mark. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous revolutionaries are not those who fight with blades, but those who rewrite the rules of survival in silence. In the end, the temple's bells still rang, the incense still drifted. But in every whispered transaction, every loan offered with a wink and a prayer, the legacy of the monk who ran an illegal banking network endured, a testament to the power of compassion, calculation, and the courage to defy the order of things, all beneath the mask of sanctity. The Ronin who sold samurai privileges. In the twilight of the samurai era, as ancient codes began to fray, there emerged a new breed of opportunist, one who understood that honor, once absolute, could be bought, sold, and even forged. Among the crowded alleys and shadowed tea houses of Edo, rumors swirled of a masterless samurai, a Ronin, who had discovered a way to profit not from the blade, but from the deep hunger of others to wear the mask of power. Once, this man had been a retainer, sworn to a great house, his life given meaning by loyalty and the right to bear the two swords of his caste. But when his lord fell to politics or war, he was cast out, stripped of income, drifting on the margins of a society obsessed with rank. For many, such a fall meant beggary, banditry, or the slow erosion of pride. For him, it was a challenge. How could a man with nothing but a name and a sword turn the emptiness into gold? He saw the truth others ignored. The rigid system of status in feudal Japan was both a fortress and a prison. Merchants, despite their growing wealth, were legally barred from the privileges of the warrior class. No swords, no family crests, no right to walk unchallenged through a world ruled by samurai. Yet the desire to escape scrutiny, to move freely, to shield one's family from petty lords and predatory officials, burned in every ambitious merchant's heart. It was here, in the shadows between law and longing, that the Ronin made his offer. He presented himself as a fixer, a man who could, for the right price, provide honor protection. Through secret meetings and smoke-filled inns, he promised new identities. For a sack of coin, a merchant could buy forged documents, fabricated family histories, and most importantly, a hand-painted samurai crest, a badge of legitimacy, a shield against harassment. To the authorities, a merchant thus equipped appeared to be under the patronage of a powerful house, untouchable, unquestionable, and above all, respectable. The Ronin was a master of paperwork and performance. He employed skilled artists to duplicate crests, scribes to imitate the archaic hand of family registers, and even actors to pose as retainers or distant relatives during inspections. When word spread of a new crackdown by magistrates, his customers flocked to him in droves. Fear, it seemed, was a more reliable currency than rice or silver. But every transaction was a dance with disaster. The Ronin operated in a world of shifting loyalties, where trust could dissolve in an instant and betrayal lurked behind every smile. He relied on bribed officials, cryptic codes, and a tight circle of accomplices. Yet for all his caution, he could not completely erase the risks. Some of his clients were plants sent by jealous rivals or ambitious constables. Each time he narrowly escaped, his legend grew, and so did the price of his services. His fortune multiplied. The merchants who bought his protection could suddenly expand their businesses, travel across domains, and negotiate with samurai on equal terms. In return, the Ronin received a cut of every deal, a hidden hand in the new economy. He became both gatekeeper and ghost, growing rich not by the sword but by the power of myth, the dream that anyone for a price could step outside the cage of birth. Yet wealth brought new dangers. Other Ronin, less gifted or more desperate, tried to muscle in on his trade. Some threatened violence, others attempted blackmail. The authorities, embarrassed by rumors of merchants wielding false crests, intensified their hunts. Every new arrest brought the risk of exposure. Every new forgery, a fresh trail for investigators to follow. The Ronin's nights became sleepless, haunted by suspicion and the echo of his own footsteps down empty corridors. He became a paradox, simultaneously feared and sought after, both a traitor to his caste and a savior to those beneath it. Samurai purists despised him for polluting the sacred codes. Merchants whispered prayers of thanks. But he knew better than anyone that he walked a razor's edge. In his heart, there was no real safety. Only the next clever lie, the next disguise, the next bribe. Eventually, the net closed. A trusted associate, broken by interrogation or seduced by reward, betrayed him. Samurai stormed the inn where he was staying, seizing records, crests, and lists of his clients. The trial was swift and brutal. He was charged not just with forgery and fraud, but with dishonoring the sacred samurai class. Before a jeering crowd, the Ronin was executed. His story offered as a cautionary tale for those who would try to sell the intangible power of honor. But the truth lingered, stubborn and sharp. Even as his name was erased from official histories, his legacy endured. The crests he had forged continued to circulate, his methods copied by other outcasts and dreamers. And in the back rooms of the city, where ambition still outpaced law, his ghost was remembered as the man who dared to put a price on privilege, a Ronin who exposed the hollowness at the heart of a world built on appearances. In the end, he proved that no system, no matter how tightly controlled, can ever truly lock away the human hunger for status, protection, and freedom. His life was a fleeting rebellion, a flash of cunning in an age of rules, and a warning that every mask of honor can be bought, worn, and lost again to the endless shadows. The village that pretended to be a shrine. Beneath the shadow of ancient mountains, in an age when the weight of taxes could starve entire families, survival demanded more than backbreaking labor. It demanded cunning, a willingness to bend the world's rules, even as officials and lords grew ever more vigilant. Among the countless stories of hardship and rebellion in feudal Japan, few are as quietly subversive or as astonishing as the tale of the starving village that outwitted the state by becoming almost overnight a sacred place. This is the true story of the village that pretended to be a shrine, and how desperate people, using nothing but their wits and a flair for theater, kept their children fed and their lives intact for 12 astonishing years. It began, as so many acts of resistance do, with hunger. The village, tucked away beyond the main roads and half forgotten by the regional daimyo, had endured years of poor harvests, harsh winters, and impossible taxes. Each year, inspectors would arrive, clipboards in hand, eyes sharp for hidden stores of rice or signs of illegal fishing. There were no samurai here, no armies to fight off the collectors, only worn-out farmers and fishermen, growing thinner as each season passed. Hope seemed to shrink with every ledger entry, but the village headman, an old man named Genzo, refused to accept extinction. He saw an opportunity in a loophole buried deep in the laws of the Shogunate. Land designated as sacred, especially if serving as a recognized shrine, was exempt from certain taxes and could not be seized or conscripted. The authorities, superstitious and fearful of offending the kami, rarely questioned such claims, especially in remote regions. So Genzo proposed a plan as outrageous as it was brilliant. If they could not survive as a village, they would endure as a shrine. The entire community joined in. They built makeshift torii gates from the straightest trees they could find, painting them in whatever colors they could salvage. At dawn and dusk, the villagers, once field hands and netcasters, became priests, acolytes, and shrine maidens, donning hastily sewn robes and practicing rituals copied from distant, legitimate temples. Children memorized prayers. Elders concocted myths about ancient spirits said to haunt the valley. When the first tax inspectors arrived, they were met by the sound of bells, the scent of incense, and a procession winding solemnly around a crude altar. The inspectors, weary and somewhat superstitious themselves, made careful notes. They interviewed the headman, who explained the ancient traditions and showed them a handwritten genealogy of local kami. The villagers never broke character. Their devotion seemed absolute. And so, not wishing to risk the wrath of offended spirits, or to explain themselves if a real priest ever came to investigate, the officials marked the settlement as a religious site, exempt from regular taxation. For 12 years, the ruse held. The villagers staged seasonal festivals, complete with music, lanterns, and ritual dances. Travelers were told stories of blessings, and a few even left coins at the altar, convinced by the seriousness of the performance. Every year, as new inspectors arrived, the entire community rehearsed their roles, refining the illusion. Children grew up believing in the spirits they invoked, and the village's sense of identity shifted. What began as a desperate masquerade became, in part, their reality. Of course, the village never grew wealthy, the land was still poor and life remained hard. But freed from the worst taxes, they managed to keep enough rice to feed their own. No one grew fat, but no one starved. For a time, they were free, not by sword or rebellion, but by turning belief itself into a shield. Eventually, the deception was discovered, perhaps by a new official, less prone to superstition, or by a jealous rival settlement seeking favor. The truth unraveled, and punishment followed. Yet, even as the authorities stripped away the shrine status, they could not erase the legend. The villagers' ingenuity became the stuff of whispered tales, both cautionary and inspiring. Their story endures as a quiet rebellion, a reminder that in the harshest times, survival isn't always about strength or violence. Sometimes it is about recognizing the absurdity of power and daring to invent a new reality, one where ordinary people, with nothing left but each other, can fool the world for a while. The village that became a shrine left no great monuments, but for 12 years their faith in their own story was strong enough to bend the law itself, and in that time, hope returned to a place the world had nearly forgotten. The carpenter who blackmailed the palace. In the world of feudal Japan, where every beam and tile of a palace was a statement of power, prestige, and divine authority, there existed another kind of hierarchy, one measured not by swords but by calloused hands and sharpened eyes. The lords and shoguns commanded armies, but it was the craftsmen who shaped the bones of the castles, the silent architects of glory. Among these men was a master carpenter whose name has faded from official records, but whose act of cunning left a crack in the very foundation of the Tokugawa regime, a story whispered through generations of builders and courtiers alike. He was known across the provinces as a man whose artistry could turn timber into immortality. His tools were simple, but his understanding of joinery and balance bordered on mystical. For years he worked his way from village temples to city mansions, each commission more prestigious than the last. Eventually, his talents reached the ears of Edo Castle itself, the seat of the shogun, the beating heart of the nation. The shogunate's architects summoned him with the greatest honor, to oversee the construction of a new audience hall, a space meant to project unshakable strength to rivals and subjects alike. For months, the carpenter toiled, breathing life into cedar and cypress, orchestrating a team of laborers with a quiet authority that even samurai respected. His eye missed nothing, the weight of each pillar, the way sunlight would fall across polished floors, the resonance of footsteps echoing in the high-ceilinged chambers. When the work was done, the new hall stood flawless, a testament to the harmony between nature and human craft. The palace's overseers, eager to take credit, praised the result and prepared for the shogun's inspection. But when the time came for payment, something changed. Perhaps it was the envy of a minor official, or the stinginess of a bureaucrat wary of the carpenter's growing reputation. The promised gold was withheld. Instead, the master builder received only a fraction of what he had earned, a humiliation and a theft disguised as oversight. For a lesser craftsman, this might have meant ruin or quiet surrender. But the carpenter, whose pride was rooted as deeply as any tree, did not accept defeat. He returned to his workshop, not in anger, but with a silent determination. For every palace has secrets, tiny flaws, hidden weaknesses, places where the structure was rushed or the material substituted. Only the master builder, with his deep knowledge of every beam and joint, knew where those secrets lay. So the carpenter drafted a letter, addressed not to the petty official, but to the shogunate's most trusted ministers. In it, he politely described several concerns about the safety of the new hall, structural weaknesses that, if left unaddressed, could prove catastrophic should a tremor strike or a fire break out. The subtext was unmistakable. With a few careful words, the master carpenter had turned his private knowledge into leverage. He did not threaten openly. He simply reminded those in power that, just as a palace is held up by invisible beams, so too are reputations held up by the silent trust that things will not fall apart. Should word spread of flaws in the shogun's own palace, the illusion of invincibility could shatter overnight. Panic gripped the court. A scandal in the palace would not only shame the shogunate, but could inspire enemies, undermine alliances, and sow doubt among retainers already wary of intrigue. The ministers acted swiftly, summoning the carpenter under the pretense of urgent consultation. Behind closed doors, they handed over the withheld payment, every coin and then some, accompanied by veiled warnings and forced smiles. But in a world built on fear as much as loyalty, payment alone was not enough to erase the threat. The shogunate understood that a man who could threaten the palace once might do so again, or sell his knowledge to rivals for a higher price. So even as the gold changed hands, the carpenter was quietly placed under house arrest. No public charges, no humiliation, just a silent exile in his own home, surrounded by guards who watched both for escape and for silence. The master carpenter spent the rest of his days surrounded by woodmen and memory, forbidden from taking new commissions or speaking to other builders. Some say he continued to carve in solitude, pouring his skill into delicate figurines and puzzles for the children who brought him food. Others say he wrote a secret manual filled with warnings and wisdom, passed from apprentice to apprentice in defiance of the silence imposed upon him. In the palace, the audience hall remained standing, perfect on the surface, yet forever haunted by the knowledge that one man, with nothing but skill and quiet defiance, had forced the most powerful rulers in Japan to yield. The story became a legend, repeated in whispers by carpenters and courtiers alike. Beware the master who knows your secrets, for the strength of a palace depends not just on the stones you see, but on the invisible loyalty of those who build them. The shogunate would survive for centuries, but beneath the rituals and pageantry, a lesson echoed in the beams of every grand hall. Never underestimate those who work in silence. Power, like a palace, is only as unshakable as the trust and respect upon which it is built. And sometimes all it takes to bring an empire to its knees is the quiet courage of a single man with nothing left to lose and everything left to reveal. The outcast who became a folklore hero. He was born nameless, his parents marked by birth as Ite, filth, untouchable, forbidden from temple gates and even from walking on the same road as commoners. His world was a patchwork of humiliation and survival, his family tasked with jobs too dirty for anyone else. Tanning hides, burying the dead, sweeping the refuse from city streets, always watched, always shunned. In Tokugawa Japan, the boundaries of class were as sharp as the edge of a sword. To be Ita or Hinin was to be condemned from the moment of birth, living outside the law, outside hope, surviving on scraps in a world that denied dignity. Yet, for all their suffering, the outcast knew the land better than anyone. He learned to move in the dark, heard the secrets in alleyways, understood every back road and crumbling shrine. He grew strong carrying burdens, swift chasing stray dogs, clever at avoiding samurai boys who'd throw stones for sport. In his village, he was never truly safe, but he was respected by his own. His quick mind, courage, and quiet strength set him apart. His elders whispered that the world above would never allow one like him to rise. He listened, but a fire burned inside him that no shame could extinguish. One night, a fire broke out in the district where the city's walls met the river. Flames licked at wood and thatch, the wind turning smoke into a choking wall. Panic swept through the narrow streets as people fled, clutching children and bundles of precious belongings. He was there, hauling refuse near the noble's manor, invisible as always. But when the first shouts rang out, he ran toward the flames, not away. He saw the chaos in the manor courtyard, retainers scrambling, horses shrieking, the Lord's family trapped behind a burning gate. In that moment, rank meant nothing. He crashed through smoke and falling beams, battered down the door, found the noble and his daughter, and dragged them out through the kitchen storeroom, his hands blistered and face streaked with soot. He led them down secret paths only the outcasts used, emerging hours later, his own ragged robe singed, eyes burning but alive. The next day, word spread of the outcast who saved the noble's life. For a moment, the invisible man was seen. The Daimyo himself sent for him. The Lord, bandaged but alive, offered him a promotion, a place among the retainers, new clothes, a stipend, a chance to leave behind the world of filth and be reborn as a real man. The offer stunned even the other outcasts, who wept at the thought of one of their own finally breaking the curse. But the young man looked at the silk robe, the official scroll, the sword offered in ceremony, and shook his head. "Status doesn't cleanse blood," he said quietly. "What I am is not washed away by words or robes. Your world was built to keep us out. If I enter, I am only a ghost in another man's story. I choose my own." With those words, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, slipping away into the alleys where he had always belonged. For years after, stories spread. Some said he became a bandit leader, robbing corrupt officials and feeding the poor. Others claimed he wandered the mountains, Bameyans, saving travelers lost in storms. Mothers whispered his name to frighten children, not as a threat, but as a promise that courage and kindness could live even in those the world despised. The samurai class tried to forget him. The officials erased his deed from records, but the common people remembered. His act did not erase the centuries of prejudice, but it left a mark that could not be ignored. He became a living folk legend, proof that valor and honor were not the property of birth, but of spirit. To the outcasts, he was a hero not because he became a samurai, but because he proved that true worth comes from within, not from a name or a robe or a sword. Even as he vanished, his words echoed through generations, that dignity cannot be gifted, That true heroism leaves no trace in the records of the powerful, but endures wherever people cling to hope. And so the outcast who saved a noble and refused to trade his soul for status became more than a man. He became a legend, a whispered reminder that some lines cannot be crossed, and that sometimes the greatest defiance is to walk away from the power that would make you forget where you came from. In a world obsessed with purity and rank, he proved that the most lasting courage is to accept yourself and vanish, leaving only the truth of your deed to speak for you forever.